The Treasury had a squiggly roof, and for a few years, that roof meant something. In 1975, six brand new stores opened across the San Francisco Bay Area, their zigzag roof lines catching the California sun. It was the farthest west this chain would ever go. It would also be the last time it ever expanded anywhere. Under that roof, a family could do almost everything in one trip. Buy groceries, fill a prescription, get a haircut, have a photo taken, drop off dry cleaning, fix a flat tire. It was one of the first stores in America built on the idea that shopping shouldn't require 4 different stops and 4 different parking lots. Owned by J.C. Penney, the same company still selling khakis and bedsheets in malls today, this discount chain quietly built 34 locations across 7 states. Then, in 1981, every single one closed. Not gradually, almost all at once. How does a company invent an idea decades ahead of its time and still manage to disappear so completely that even J.C. Penney barely mentions it happened? This is the story of the Treasury. David Kritzik ran a mail-order business out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It was 1938, and the General Merchandise Company sold goods the way most mail-order houses did back then, through catalogs mailed to homes across the upper Midwest, filled in and sent back with a check. It was steady work, the kind that built a modest but reliable trade. Kritzik brought his 2 sons, Robert and Stanley, into the business, and for more than 20 years, that was the whole story. A family selling merchandise by mail, one order at a time. But by the late 1950s, the Kritzicks were watching something change. Discount retailing was starting to take hold across the country. Big, no-frills stores selling name-brand goods at cut prices. No catalog required. The mail-order model that had built the family business was starting to look like the past. So the Kritzicks decided to try something bigger than a catalog. They decided to build a store. Not just any store, a concept they called Treasure Island. And it was unlike anything Wisconsin shoppers had seen before. On November 24, 1961, the first Treasure Island opened its doors in Appleton, Wisconsin. It was enormous by the standards of the day. 200,000 square feet, roughly the footprint of 4 football fields, all under one roof. And that roof was the first thing anyone noticed. Designed by Milwaukee architect Jordan A. Miller, it folded back and forth in a sharp zigzag pattern, inside and out, catching light in a way no ordinary flat-roof store ever could. Locals didn't call it modern architecture. They called it the squiggly roof. And the nickname stuck so hard that Treasure Island advertised itself using the phrase for the next decade. Inside, the store was built around a single promise: everything in one place for less. Shoppers pushed carts past aisles of clothing, housewares, toys, and hardware. The kind of general merchandise a family might otherwise drive to 3 or 4 different stores to collect. And when they finally reached the checkout, Treasure Island offered something that felt almost like science fiction to a Wisconsin shopper in 1961. A conveyor belt that carried bagged purchases outside and delivered them directly to the customer's car. For the Kritzicks, Treasure Island wasn't just a new sales channel bolted onto the mail-order business. It was a bet that the future of American retail belonged to stores built at enormous scale, stripped of extra frills, and priced to beat everyone else on the block. It was a family's entire business, reimagined for a country that was falling in love with the automobile, the suburb, and the idea that shopping should be fast, big, and cheap. The bet worked well enough and fast enough that it caught the attention of a much larger company, one already operating hundreds of stores across the country and looking for a way into the discount business it didn't yet have a foothold in. Within a year of that first store opening under its squiggly roof, J.C. Penney came calling. In 1962, J.C. Penney bought General Merchandise Company outright, and with it, the Kritzik family's Treasure Island stores. For a company that had spent 6 decades selling suits, dresses, and household goods out of full-price department stores, it was a new kind of bet, a foothold in the discount business that was rapidly reshaping American retail. J.C. Penney kept the Wisconsin stores under their original name, but starting in 1969, new locations opening outside Wisconsin and Georgia would carry a different name: The Treasury. Whatever the sign out front said, the experience inside stayed the same, and it was unlike anything most American families had shopped in before. A single trip to the Treasury could replace an entire Saturday's worth of errands. There was a full grocery department, stocked like a supermarket, with meat counters and produce aisles under the same roof as the clothing racks. There was a pharmacy, so a parent could fill a prescription for a sick child without a second stop across town. There was a beauty salon, where a mother might get her hair done while her kids wandered the toy aisles. There was a photo studio for family portraits, a dry cleaner for the week's good clothes, and an auto center out back where a father could get his oil changed before the family headed home. Everything a household needed, gathered under one zigzag roof, at prices built to undercut the department stores across town, including in some ways JCPenney's own full-price stores just a few miles away. The chain grew carefully outward from its Wisconsin roots. In 1968, 4 brand-new stores opened across metro Atlanta, built along the interstate in fast-growing suburban areas, employing nearly 1,900 people between them. The cost of building just the first 3 of those stores ran to $17 million. Real money for a discount concept still proving itself outside the Midwest. By 1969, JCPenney executives looked at the results of those first 10 Treasure Island stores and called the experiment a success. New locations would go up under a fuller name: the Treasury, Family Store, and Food Center. In 1974, the chain pushed into Chicago, one of the largest and most competitive retail markets in the country. For a family driving up to one of these stores for the first time, the sheer size of the building alone made an impression. A single-story giant of a store, its roofline zigzagging against the sky, parking lot stretching out in every direction, nothing else in the area built quite like it. For the people who worked there, the Treasury offered something increasingly rare in retail, a job that touched nearly every part of a community's daily life. A pharmacist behind the counter knew regular customers by name. A grocery clerk restocking shelves might see the same families 3 times a week. A hairdresser in the salon heard the news of the neighborhood before most of the neighborhood did. Employees weren't just selling merchandise. They were running what amounted to a small town's worth of services, all under one company, one paycheck, one roof. And for shoppers, especially in the newer suburban developments springing up around cities like Atlanta and Chicago, the Treasury filled a gap that hadn't existed in older, more established neighborhoods. These were young families, often first-generation homeowners, settling into subdivisions that didn't yet have their own downtown, their own Main Street, their own anchor institutions. The Treasury became one of the first true gathering points in towns that were still being built. A place where you didn't just buy things, you ran into your neighbors while you did it. By the mid-1970s, the chain had reached its widest footprint yet. 34 stores stretched from Wisconsin, south to Georgia, west to Texas, and, as of March 1975, as far as Northern California, where 6 stores opened across the San Francisco Bay Area. On paper, it looked like a company still climbing. New markets, new construction, a concept that had proven itself in enough cities to keep expanding. But growing wide is not the same as growing deep. And a chain that had spent more than a decade building 1 or 2 stores at a time in city after city without ever fully dominating a single region the way its competitors had, was quietly carrying a weakness that its shoppers, waiting in line at the grocery counter or picking up a portrait at the photo studio, had no reason to notice at all. What would it take for a store this useful, this woven into daily life, to actually turn a real profit? That question was already being asked in boardrooms far from any Treasury checkout counter, and the answer was not one that JCPenney executives wanted to hear. The decision to keep expanding the Treasury did not come from a single dramatic boardroom meeting. It came from a pattern JCPenney executives kept repeating, market after market, for more than a decade. And it was a pattern that looked reasonable every single time it was made, even as it quietly built a company with no true home turf. Unlike most successful discount chains of the era, the Treasury never tried to dominate a single region before moving to the next one. Kmart was blanketing entire states with dozens of stores apiece. Zayre was doing the same across the Northeast and South. The Treasury took a different approach, open a small cluster of stores in a new city, let them find their footing, and then move on to the next market rather than deepen its presence in the one it had just entered. Wisconsin got its handful of stores. Georgia got 4. Illinois got a foothold in Chicago. Texas got Dallas. Tennessee got Memphis, where the chain ran under the Treasury name alongside a matching drugstore concept. And by 1975, Northern California got 6 stores in a single push into the Bay Area. Each of these moves, taken on its own, made a certain kind of sense. A new metro area meant a fresh population of shoppers who had never seen a squiggly roof before, fresh real estate becoming available as suburbs pushed outward, and a chance to prove the concept could travel beyond its Wisconsin birthplace. Penney's leadership had reason to be confident. The stores that opened well. Communities embraced them. Employees were hired in the hundreds at every new location. From inside any single Treasury store, business looked like it was working exactly as intended. But scattering 10 stores across 7 states is a fundamentally different business than concentrating 50 stores across 2 or 3. A regional chain can build one distribution network, one set of supplier relationships, one advertising campaign that reaches the same customers over and over until the brand becomes second nature. A chain spread thin across a continent has to rebuild much of that infrastructure in every new city it enters. New warehouses, new local suppliers for the grocery departments, new advertising budgets to introduce a brand that meant nothing yet to a shopper in Dallas or Memphis who had never set foot in a Wisconsin treasure island. The economies of scale that made discount retailing profitable in the first place were harder to capture when a company's footprint looked less like a fist and more like a handful of scattered fingers. Inside the stores themselves, the physical format kept expanding along with the geography. Later Treasury locations grew even larger than the original Appleton store, adding more square footage for the grocery and pharmacy departments as Penney leaned harder into the everything under one roof pitch that had made the concept distinctive in the first place. Store design evolved city by city. The zigzag roof line stayed a constant signature, but layouts were adjusted for each new market, each new customer base, each new set of local competitors already sitting on the block. It meant every new Treasury wasn't simply a copy of the last one. It was, in some ways, its own small experiment, repeated over and over across the map. For the employees hired into this growing chain, expansion meant real opportunity. A young store manager in Appleton might get the chance to help open a brand new location in Atlanta or Chicago, taking on more responsibility than he could have found staying in one place. Pharmacists, grocery managers, and department heads found a company that was on paper still building, still hiring, still constructing, still betting on more stores rather than fewer. For a working family in the 1960s and early 1970s, a management job at the Treasury looked like a company on the way up. What none of them could see from the sales floor was the arithmetic accumulating several layers above them, inside Penney's own corporate offices. A chain of 30-some stores scattered across 7 states, each one requiring its own local supply chain and its own effort to build customer loyalty from scratch, was proving far more expensive to run and far harder to turn genuinely profitable than the neat, single-region empires being built by its competitors. The Treasury wasn't failing, not yet, but it also wasn't succeeding in the way a business its size was supposed to. By 1975, with 6 new stores opening across the San Francisco Bay Area, Penney had pushed the concept about as far from its Wisconsin roots as it would ever go. It was also, though no one announced it at the time, about as far as the Treasury would ever get. 1975 marked the high point of the Treasury, though almost no one inside the company would have called it that at the time. High points rarely announce themselves. They just look like an ordinary year of business. And for the Treasury, that ordinary year happened to be the widest the chain would ever reach. 34 stores now stood under that unmistakable zigzag roofline, spread across 7 states from the Midwest to the south, to the southwest, and finally that spring to the West Coast. The 6 Bay Area stores that opened in March 1975 gave Northern California shoppers their first look at a concept that had been building steadily for 14 years, a single building that could replace an entire Saturday's worth of errands. For a chain that started as one Wisconsin family's mail-order business, reaching California felt like proof that the idea had made it, that a store built around a folded zigzag roof and a promise of everything in one place could work just as well 3,000 miles from where it began as it had in Appleton. Driving past a Treasury store in the mid-1970s meant driving past something you couldn't mistake for anything else on the block. No other retailer's roofline looked like that. In an era before big box stores had settled into the flat, beige sameness that would define the format for decades to come, the Treasury's zigzag architecture stood out. A genuine landmark visible from the highway, recognizable to a kid in the back seat of the family car long before the store's name came into view. That roof did something few retail chains ever manage. It became instantly identifiable without a single word of signage. Inside, the experience had settled into something close to a ritual for the families who lived near one. A Saturday morning trip to the Treasury might start with groceries for the week, move on to a stop at the pharmacy counter to refill a prescription, swing past the beauty salon for a mother's standing appointment, and end at the photo studio, where a family might sit for the kind of formal portrait that would hang on a living room wall for the next 20 years. Kids tagged along through toy aisles while parents handled the week's real business. It wasn't glamorous. It was something better than glamorous. It was useful, dependable, woven into the rhythm of a week the way a good local diner or a trusted mechanic becomes woven into a neighborhood's life. For employees, working at the Treasury during these years meant being part of something that touched a community in ways a single-purpose store never could. A pharmacist wasn't just filling prescriptions. He was often the only pharmacist a family in a growing suburb had ever known, the one who remembered which child was allergic to what. A grocery department manager wasn't just stocking shelves. She was helping run what amounted to the neighborhood supermarket in a subdivision that, 10 years earlier, hadn't had a supermarket at all. In towns built quickly around interstate exits and new housing developments, the kind of towns that didn't yet have an established downtown or a Main Street institution passed down through generations, the Treasury often was the institution, the place everyone's parents shopped, the place a family's grandparents, if they lived nearby, might have taken their own kids to years before, and now watched their grandchildren wander the same aisles. That kind of generational familiarity is not something a company can manufacture. It has to be earned, store visit by store visit, over years. And by 1975, the Treasury had earned it in city after city: Milwaukee, Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Memphis, and now San Francisco. Even if the chain, taken as a whole, was still struggling to turn that community goodwill into the kind of profit margins its competitors were posting. Because that was the quiet, uncomfortable truth sitting just beneath the surface of 1975's expansion. The same year the Treasury reached its farthest point west, it had also reached the farthest point it would ever grow. There would be no 7th state, no 35th store, no announcement, no fanfare, no sense at the time that anyone had just watched a company hit its ceiling. What does it mean for a business to peak in the very same year it looks, from the outside, most alive? That question wouldn't have an answer for a few more years yet. But somewhere inside J.C.Penney's corporate offices, far from any zigzag rooftop, the people responsible for the Treasury's balance sheet were already starting to run out of patience. The trouble with the Treasury was never a single dramatic failure. It was something quieter and more corrosive. A chain that had never in 14 years of operation managed to become genuinely, reliably profitable. And by the mid-1970s, J.C.Penney's patience for that arrangement was beginning to run out. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. Stores were full. Parking lots were busy on Saturday mornings. The grocery aisles moved product. The pharmacy counters filled prescriptions. The photo studios booked appointments weeks in advance for the holidays. A shopper walking into a Treasury store in 1976 would have had no reason to suspect that several floors up in J.C. Penney's corporate headquarters, executives were looking at the same set of numbers year after year and asking an increasingly pointed question. Why does a chain doing this much business never actually turn a real profit? The answer lived in the very structure that had made the Treasury distinctive in the first place. Being spread across 7 states, with only a handful of stores in each one, meant the chain never enjoyed the deep economies of scale that turned discount retailing profitable for its competitors. Kmart could negotiate with suppliers as a company running hundreds of nearly identical stores concentrated in dense regional clusters. The Treasury, with its scattered handful of locations in Wisconsin, Georgia, Illinois, Texas, Tennessee, and California, was negotiating as something closer to 7 small regional chains wearing one name. Every new grocery supplier relationship in a new state had to be built almost from scratch. Every advertising dollar spent introducing the brand to Bay Area shoppers in 1975 did nothing to help sell groceries in Memphis. The very geographic spread that had once looked like ambition now looked to the people running the numbers like a structural weakness the chain might never outgrow. There was a second problem sitting quietly underneath the first one, and it had nothing to do with geography. The Treasury's entire pitch to shoppers, everything under one roof, groceries and pharmacy and beauty salon and auto center all bundled together, required an enormous amount of retail space and an enormous amount of overhead to operate every one of those departments well. A pure discount chain selling only clothing and housewares could run leaner, staff thinner, and turn a profit on lower margins. The Treasury was running what amounted to 5 or 6 different businesses under one roof in every single location, and every one of those departments needed its own staff, its own inventory, its own management. It was an extraordinary convenience for the shopper, standing in the parking lot with a full week's worth of errands ahead of her. It was an extraordinarily expensive proposition for the company paying to keep every department stocked and staffed. For the people working inside individual Treasury stores, none of this arithmetic was visible day to day. A grocery manager in Chicago had no way of knowing that the beauty salon 2 aisles over was barely breaking even, or that the pharmacy in Memphis was carrying costs the one in Wisconsin never had to. What store-level employees noticed, if they noticed anything at all in these years, was smaller and more anecdotal. A shipment that arrived a little late, a renovation budget that got trimmed, a corporate visit that asked more pointed questions about department-by-department performance than visits in years past had. Nothing alarming, nothing that read in the moment as the beginning of the end. Just the ordinary friction of a large company managing a complicated business. But friction like that rarely stays contained to a single year. And by the back half of the 1970s, J.C. Penney's leadership had begun looking hard at the parts of the Treasury's model that cost the most and delivered the least, starting with the very department that had once made the chain feel like nothing else in American retail. How much longer could a company keep funding a concept this expensive to run, when the concept itself had never proven it could turn a real, lasting profit? That question was no longer being asked quietly. And the first answer J.C. Penney's leadership landed on would strike directly at the heart of what had made the Treasury special in the first place. In 1977, J.C. Penney made the decision that historians of the chain now point to as the beginning of the end. The company shut down every supermarket department in every Treasury store, nationwide, in one stroke. It is difficult to overstate what that decision actually removed. The grocery department wasn't simply one profit center among several inside a Treasury store. It was the reason many families walked through the doors in the first place. Groceries are a weekly, sometimes twice-weekly necessity. Clothing and housewares are not. A family that needed a new coat might visit a discount store once a season. A family that needed milk, bread, and meat for dinner needed a grocery store every few days. And for years, the Treasury had positioned itself to be that store, week after week, for thousands of households who had built an entire shopping habit around it. Strip out the groceries, and you strip out the single strongest reason a customer had to walk through those doors on any given Tuesday. From a balance sheet, the logic was defensible. Supermarket departments run on razor-thin margins even under the best circumstances, and running one well requires a completely different set of skills, suppliers, and infrastructure than running a discount clothing floor. J.C. Penney executives, looking at years of underwhelming Treasury profits, could point to the grocery operation as an expensive, complicated piece of the business that never contributed what it cost to run. Cutting it looked, on paper, like the kind of disciplined decision a struggling division needed. What that decision could not account for was habit. The families who had spent a decade treating the Treasury as their neighborhood's supermarket plus everything else didn't simply shift their clothing purchases to the remaining departments once the groceries disappeared. Many of them stopped coming as often, period. The weekly visit that used to bring a shopper past the clothing racks, the pharmacy counter, and the toy aisle on her way to buy dinner ingredients was gone. What remained was a discount department store that looked increasingly like every other discount department store on the block, except without the one thing that had ever made it different. 2 years later, in 1979, the consequences of that shrinking identity showed up in a place JCPenney's leadership couldn't spin as a routine cost-cutting measure. The Treasury pulled entirely out of Chicago, one of the largest, most competitive retail markets the chain had ever entered. A city that had represented real ambition just 5 years earlier, proof that the Treasury could compete in a major metro market against giants like Kmart and Zayre, was now the site of the chain's first outright retreat. For employees at the Chicago area stores, many of whom had been hired during the excitement of the 1974 expansion, the announcement landed as a genuine shock. Stores that had opened with hope closed with almost no warning. Workers left to find new jobs in a retail sector that was, at that exact moment, growing more competitive and less forgiving by the year. Behind the scenes at JCPenney's corporate offices, the debate over the Treasury's future had shifted from "how do we fix this?" to something closer to "how much longer do we keep trying?" The chain's leadership faced a genuinely difficult question with no comfortable answer. Continue pouring investment into a division that had never proven it could be reliably profitable, or accept that 14 years and 34 stores had not been enough to make the discount experiment work, and begin the process of shutting it down for good. There was no single villain in this story, no reckless executive chasing a bonus, no headline-making scandal. Just a large, cautious corporation slowly running out of reasons to keep funding a business line that, department by department, kept failing to justify its own overhead. For the people still working inside Treasury stores in Wisconsin, Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, and California through 1979 and into 1980, the mood on the sales floor had changed in ways that were hard to name precisely but impossible to ignore. Deliveries that once arrived reliably now came with more delays. Store maintenance that once kept the zigzag roofs and wide aisles looking sharp began slipping in smaller, quieter ways. A light fixture left unreplaced a little longer. A section of shelving that didn't get restocked quite as fast as it used to. Nothing any single customer could point to and call a crisis. Just the accumulated weight of a company that had stopped investing in a future it no longer fully believed in. By the start of 1980, inflation and interest rates across the American economy had climbed to levels that punished any business already operating on thin margins, and the Treasury, weakened by the loss of its grocery departments and its retreat from Chicago, had almost no cushion left to absorb the blow. The division that had once represented a genuinely new idea in American retail was now, in the eyes of the company that owned it, simply a cost that no longer made sense to carry. The only question left was not whether the Treasury would close. It was how much longer JCPenney would wait to say so out loud. On February 17, 1981, readers of the Appleton Post-Crescent, the same Wisconsin newspaper that had covered the opening of the very first Treasure Island store nearly 20 years earlier, opened their paper to a front-page headline that closed the story that same paper had once helped begin: Treasure Island stores to be closed by May. There was no slow fade to this ending, no gradual thinning of locations spread out over years the way some struggling chains wind down. J.C. Penney announced that all 34 Treasury stores across all 7 states would close within roughly 3 months. Wisconsin, Georgia, Illinois, Texas, Tennessee, California. The chain that had spent nearly 2 decades expanding one careful market at a time was going to disappear in a single season. For the employees who read that headline or heard the news from a store manager gathering staff on the sales floor, the announcement landed with a particular kind of disorientation. Many of them had spent years, in some cases their entire working lives, inside these stores. Pharmacists who knew 3 generations of a family by name. Grocery clerks who had watched neighborhood kids grow up shopping with their parents and then later come back as teenagers with their first paychecks. Beauty salon operators who had been doing the same customer's hair every other Thursday for a decade. None of them were losing an anonymous corporate job. They were losing the institution that had organized a meaningful part of their working lives, and for many there was no equivalent job waiting for them once the doors locked for good. Retail employment in 1981 was not an easy market to land in. The same economic pressures, inflation, high interest rates, a national recession tightening its grip that had helped kill the Treasury were making it harder for laid-off workers everywhere to find their next paycheck. For customers, the closure announcement triggered something that felt less like a business story and more like a small local loss, repeated in city after city. Families who had built a decade of Saturday mornings around a trip to the Treasury now faced a countdown. There would be a last visit to the pharmacy counter, a last portrait taken at the photo studio, whether anyone realized at the time it was the last one or not. A last time pushing a cart past the grocery aisles that had, 4 years earlier, already been stripped down to almost nothing. In towns where the Treasury had been one of the only true gathering spots, the suburbs and interstate exits that had grown up around these stores without ever developing an old-fashioned main street of their own. The closure didn't just remove a retailer. It removed one of the only places in town where you were guaranteed to run into someone you knew. As the stores wound down through the spring of 1981, the ritual played out the way it does at the end of almost every large retail chain. Liquidation signs went up in the windows, first announcing modest discounts, then deeper and deeper markdowns as May approached, and inventory had to move at any price. Shelves that had once been carefully stocked with clothing, housewares, and toys grew emptier by the week, gaps widening between the remaining merchandise until entire sections of the store sat bare. The zigzag roofline, once a landmark you could spot from the highway and know exactly what waited underneath it, now sat over buildings being quietly, systematically hollowed out. By May 1981, it was over. 34 stores, 7 states, nearly 20 years of history, closed all at once, without the kind of national mourning that might follow the collapse of a more famous chain. What happened next to those 34 empty buildings tells its own quiet story about what the Treasury had actually been, and about the strange afterlife hiding inside American retail real estate. These were not ordinary storefronts. At 200,000 square feet apiece, with their distinctive folded rooflines, Treasury buildings were oversized, oddly shaped, and hard to repurpose for anything smaller than another big box retailer. But that scale, which had made the chain so expensive to run, made the empty buildings perfect for whatever came next in American retailing. In Atlanta, 4 former Treasury and Zayre buildings became, in 1979, even before the chain's full collapse, the very first Home Depot stores ever opened. The company that would go on to become one of the largest home improvement retailers in the world began its life inside the leftover shell of a discount chain that couldn't make its own numbers work. In Milwaukee, former Treasury locations were carved up and reborn as Kohl's department stores. Alongside TJ Maxx and Burlington Outlets and Pick and Save supermarkets. The grocery function. The Treasury had abandoned in 1977, quietly returning to the same buildings under a different name. In the Atlanta suburbs, one former location eventually became a Value City discount store. Another sat through an office depot before giving way to a flea market. 2 others were absorbed into county government offices and a convention center. Their retail life ended for good. There was no unified answer to what became of the Treasury's buildings, because there had never been a unified answer to what the Treasury itself actually was. One part supermarket, one part pharmacy, one part department store, one part beauty salon, all bundled under a single oversized roof. When the company that built that bundle gave up on trying to make it profitable, the buildings simply got unbundled right back into the separate, specialized businesses the Treasury had once tried to replace. A Kohl's here, a Home Depot there, a supermarket in the same footprint where the old Treasury grocery aisles used to run. For the people who had worked the checkout counters, stocked the shelves, and filled the prescriptions, the story ended less symbolically and more personally. Some found new jobs at the very retailers who took over their old buildings. A strange kind of continuity, showing up for a shift at a Kohl's occupying the same physical space where they'd once worked for the Treasury. Others left retail altogether, pushed by a recession-battered job market into whatever work they could find. The pharmacists, notably, had somewhere to go. Penney had already built a drugstore division called Treasury Drug, and it would go on to survive the parent chain's 1981 collapse by more than a decade, eventually folding into the Eckerd chain in the 1990s. One small piece of the old Treasury empire that outlived the empire itself. What closed in the spring of 1981 wasn't just 34 stores. It was an idea that a family could walk through one set of doors and handle an entire week's worth of errands under a single unmistakable roof, that had been years ahead of its time and years short of the profit margins it needed to survive long enough to prove itself right. The buildings that once carried the Treasury's zigzag roofline didn't sit empty for long, and what filled them says something important about the retail landscape that came after 1981. Home Depot's earliest expansion, built partly on the bones of former Treasury and Zayre locations in Atlanta, went on to reshape how Americans bought lumber, paint, and hardware for the next 4 decades. Kohl's absorbed several Milwaukee area stores and built them into anchors of its own growing department store chain. In market after market, the specialized retailers that took over, a supermarket here, a home improvement store there, a discount clothing chain somewhere else, succeeded at something the Treasury never quite managed, doing one thing extremely well rather than 5 things adequately under one roof. That contrast became, in hindsight, the clearest lesson the industry took from the Treasury's collapse. The everything under one roof concept wasn't wrong exactly. Supercenters combining groceries and general merchandise would eventually become one of the most successful formats in American retail, pioneered by chains willing to commit fully to the model and build the scale needed to make it profitable. What the Treasury proved unintentionally was that trying it halfway, spread thin across 7 states with no single dominant region, wasn't enough. The idea needed either full commitment or none at all. Penney, a company built on full-price department stores, had never fully committed to being a discount grocer/pharmacist/department store, and by 1977, it had proven that hesitation with its own hand, cutting the one department that gave shoppers a reason to visit every single week. For the communities that had built a decade or more of routine around a nearby Treasury, the closures left a gap that wasn't always filled the same way twice. In some towns, a new retailer moved into the old building within a year or two, and the loss of the Treasury blurred quickly into whatever came next. Shoppers adjusting their habits, finding a new pharmacy, a new place to grab groceries on a Tuesday evening. In others, particularly smaller markets without the retail density of a growing city like Atlanta or Chicago, the closure left a longer, quieter absence. A 200,000 square foot building with a distinctive folded roof is not an easy thing to fill, and some sat vacant for years, a landmark that once meant Saturday errands slowly becoming a landmark for nothing at all. For the thousands of people who had worked inside those stores, the pharmacists, the grocery clerks, the salon operators, the store managers who had spent years building a career inside a company that no longer existed. The aftermath played out one job search at a time, without much national attention paid to any of it. Some, as it happened, didn't have to look far. Treasury Drug, the pharmacy division J.C. Penney had built alongside its discount stores, survived the 1981 shutdown of its parent chain and kept operating through the 1980s and into the 1990s, eventually becoming part of the Eckerd chain when J.C. Penney consolidated its drugstore holdings. For a pharmacist who had built a career filling prescriptions under the Treasury name, that meant a door stayed open even as 34 stores worth of colleagues in every other department were sent looking for new work in a recession-battered economy. What the Treasury left behind, more than any single lesson about retail strategy, was a quiet reminder of how completely a company can vanish from public memory even after building something genuinely ambitious. 34 stores, 7 states, nearly 20 years in business. A roofline distinctive enough that people still called it squiggly decades after the last store closed. And yet ask most Americans today, even ones who once wheeled a shopping cart past its grocery aisles as kids, and the name barely registers. J.C. Penney, the parent company, went on to become one of the most famous retail collapses in modern American history in its own right. And in the shadow of that much larger, much more publicized story, the Treasury's own rise and fall gets barely a footnote, even in accounts of the company that built it. What does it mean when an idea disappears so completely that even the company that built it seems to have forgotten it happened? That question doesn't have a tidy answer, but it says something about how quickly American retail moves on, how a concept that once felt genuinely new, genuinely useful, genuinely worth building a Saturday morning around, can vanish so thoroughly that its own absence goes almost entirely unremarked. Somewhere in Milwaukee or Atlanta or the Bay Area, someone still remembers the roof. Not the store's name, not always. Memories fade that specifically over 50 years, but the shape of it, the way it folded back and forth against the sky like nothing else on the block, catching the afternoon light in a way flat roofs never could. They remember riding in the back seat as their mother pulled into the lot. Remember the conveyor belt carrying bags out to the car like something out of the future. Remember the smell of the grocery aisles mixed with whatever was cooking at the little photo studio counter where the family once sat for a portrait that still hangs, slightly faded now, in someone's hallway. The Treasury was never trying to be glamorous. It was trying to be useful, and for nearly 2 decades, in city after city, it succeeded at that in a way few retailers before or since have managed. It understood something true about the families it served, that a Saturday only has so many hours, that a parent juggling groceries and a prescription and a haircut and a portrait sitting doesn't need 4 separate stops and 4 separate parking lots, doesn't need 4 separate goodbyes to 4 separate cashiers. It needs one place that does it all, competently, at a price that doesn't sting. For the families in the new subdivisions of Atlanta, the growing suburbs of Chicago, the fresh developments of the Bay Area, towns still finding their own Main Street, their own sense of place, the Treasury was for a while that place. Not because it tried to be a landmark, because it simply showed up every week and did the job. It never got the chance to become a household name the way some of its competitors did. It never survived long enough to become the kind of chain people write nostalgic essays about, the way they still do for Woolworths or Sears. It closed too early, too completely, and too quietly for that. 34 stores gone in a single season, folded so fast into the ordinary churn of American retail that most people who shopped there never got the chance to say goodbye. There was no farewell sale advertised for weeks in advance, no local news segment mourning the last day. Just a headline in a Wisconsin newspaper, a liquidation sale, and then nothing. But something real happened under those zigzag roofs in city after city for the better part of 20 years. Families were fed, prescriptions were filled, portraits were taken that still sit in frames on someone's wall. A generation of kids grew up believing, without ever thinking about it consciously, that a trip to the store meant one big building where everything you needed was somehow already there, waiting. That idea outlived the company that built it. It just wears different names now, in different buildings. Some of them the very same buildings the Treasury left behind. Home Depot got its start in a few of them. Kohl's built a chain out of others. The concept didn't fail. The company running it simply ran out of time to prove it right. The Treasury deserves to be remembered not as a cautionary tale of corporate mismanagement, but as something more ordinary and more human than that. An idea that arrived a little too early, spread a little too thin, and asked a struggling parent company to believe in it a little longer than that company was willing to. The Kritzik family built it out of a Milwaukee mail-order business. J.C. Penney carried it as far as Northern California. And somewhere between those 2 points, thousands of employees spent careers making it work, one Saturday morning at a time, for customers who never knew, and never needed to know, how close to the edge the whole operation always was. The roof is gone now, in every city it once stood in. But for the people who remember it, it still folds back and forth against the sky. Just for a moment, every time someone mentions a store they can barely name, in a building that's been 3 other things since, that once made a Saturday feel like it was handled. All of it, everywhere, under one roof.